and I will try, and you enter, you click enter or return, depending on your keyboard, and I will try and reply to them as soon as possible. So our speaker today is Skip Brown, who has 39 years of experience in the field of histotechnology, over 30 of which being at the supervisory and management levels. He has managed some of the most progressive clinical and research institutions, such as Kaiser Permanente of Southern California and Northwestern University Pathology Core Facility. His passion is teaching and training, and he has been one of the premier educators in the U.S. in lab management and histotechnology. He has given workshops and lectures nationally and internationally and was awarded the Excellence in Teaching Award at the National Society for Histotechnology Symposium. Having designed and managed laboratory systems in the past, Skip has always been fascinated at various examples of laboratory workflow and how instrumentations have been integrated into the system to streamline the flow and processes. He is particularly interested in the European models and examples of lab flow and how the newest technology in instrumentations is being utilized within the systems. So Skip, I'm going to give you, so welcome again. Let me give you the presentation, the presenter's rights. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And now you should be able to share your screen, selecting PowerPoint, and then put it, perfect, and then put it on the slideshow mode, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Skip.
Thank you, Eric, and I am honored to be a part of the Lack of Biosystems educational event this month and their whole series of events that they have. To the listening audience, I want to say to you, welcome, and I'm very honored to be able to present to you, and I always like to acknowledge that continuing education and continued development is so important in our profession. Many times we get so engrossed in our laboratories that we forget that the medical profession is continually growing and changing, and different things that analyses or tests or for the patient, particularly if you're working in patient care, continue to grow and evolve. And we as healthcare professionals must continue to grow and evolve with that. And so I applaud you and I commend you for your efforts today, particularly to take something that is considered somewhat elementary, such as H&E staining, routine staining. Within this, since it is used so abundantly on patient testing, we always have to look at how our systems are working. And note the title of this session is Validating Your H&E Staining Systems. The plurality of that shows that it's not just the stain that we're using or the protocol or procedure that we're using. There are a number of different things that go into the success of using an H&E stain to diagnose patient specimens or patients. And so all of those different things have to be validated to the point where you can ensure that each one of those elements of the H&E stain have been developed, validated, and you can be assured that they are working perfectly to give you this perfect H&E stain. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and I want to move on to the objectives. But once again, congratulations, and I commend you for your continued growth and development today. So some of the objectives that we're going to talk about today, and I'm trying to advance, there we go. Objectives are understand the various elements of your H&E staining system and the integral role that they play in the total system validation, such as it's not just your stain, the hematoxylin or eosin. We used to think of that years ago, or it can be other things such as the stainer that you're using, the different reagents that you're using, the control that you're using, how you're using this. All of those things have to be validated so that when you have your protocol and your procedure and your methods of maintaining the stain all day long, When those are working, you have to be able to show that they are tested and will continue to be reproducible. The next is learn the differences in transitioning from one automated stainer to another, and how the protocol and or stain must be adjusted and revalidated based on the staining performance. If you move your stainer from one lab to another, or even actually from one section of the laboratory to another section of the same laboratory, you have to be able to validate that everything is working exactly the same before. There are a number of different variables that can come into play. The faucets that you use from one area of the lab to another could be different. It could be. Just the installation of the instrument could have changed. So you need to just be able to validate that the performance is exactly the same as before you moved it. Learn how to develop a validated stain protocol through a series of staining trials, documenting the various protocol changes, what you do from one run to another, and the final protocol approved by the pathologist. I'm going to show you a simple way to actually do this validation, where you can have on one document, you can look back and see the history of the different things that you've tried. So sometimes when there's an extended validation process, we go back, and if we haven't recorded this, we wind up repeating the same thing that we tried before in trying to get a stain that the doctor considers acceptable. So this way you can have all of this on one document. You can look back and see the transitions, and it can give you more information from one trial to another. And also in that, it can show you that you don't need to go around and change 6 or 7 or 8 different things when you're going from one trial to tweak it to go to another. You can basically reduce that down to 3 or 4 different variables, and you just go back and forth changing the timings and some subtle changes on that to develop the type of stain that your pathologist feels is acceptable. The next, understand how to set up an internal quality review, monitor, document the staining, to monitor and document the staining performance from day to day. How can we validate that this stain that we started today is the same performance as the stain was yesterday? Well, most times we run a control through with the first slide. But oftentimes, if you're running high-volume slides, if you're only running like 200-300 slides, that's fine. But if you're running something like 750, 1,000, 1,500 slides a day, then I can guarantee you that that stain quality is not going to be the same as the first run that you did. So we need to not only refresh or rotate some of the alcohols, some of the xylenes, or even the hematoxylin, but we need to actually document that we've done that, and we need to have a set quality assurance measure so that we know that after so many slides, this needs to be rotated or this needs to be changed. So I'm going to talk about how to set that up very simply through a Word document. And then lastly, learn the necessity of documentation and data retention. All of this that we're going to talk about today, you have to document that, and you have to retain that data to be able to produce it for the inspector when he comes through to see if all these things have been done. So the next slide that we show is going to be talking about basically the first element, which is stain. Okay, it just skipped. Okay, no, I'm sorry. The next slide shows elements of H&E validation, which basically are the foundations of an H&E validation. And so in the H&E staining system, the first thing is that I noted was the stain. The dyes and reagents that you're going to use, you need to validate what you're using. Not just say we're using hematoxylin, you need to say what kind of hematoxylin, and also the staining method. And so is it regressive, is it progressive, is it hybrid? Some of you say, well, what is hybrid? We're going to talk about that in a few slides from this. But everyone that comes into your lab to do the inspection, especially years ago, it might not be someone who has a histotechnology background. Years ago, medical technologists would come through, even cytotechnologists, and they're very intelligent and very well versed in what they do, but many of them did not really understand histology. So if we were to talk to them about a progressive or regressive stain, they have no idea what we're talking about, oftentimes. So I like to put that in my stain document. This is the first element that you have here, stain. That's the first foundation, dyes and reagents in the staining method. The second is the stainer. What type of stainer are you using? Because for example, the protocol on that stainer. The protocol on one stainer will not necessarily and probably won't have the same stain performance on another stainer. it can be a number of different variables that change that, the rinses, the dips, and so forth. So we're going to talk about the stainer. First, the protocol that was used, and on that stainer, how you have it set up, the rinses, and some stainers have a very slight light trickle for rinse. Some have a really aggressive flush for rinse. So you need to basically note that and document that. Agitations, how it's set, how many agitations or how many dips that you have it set for. And then a template. And template basically is just how you have your reagents set up on your stainer. And it's just like taking a snapshot of the stain template and having that as part of your stainer foundation for your validation. You have to be able to show that this reagent goes in here, this dye goes in there. And so that's part of the validation portion, the stainer validation. And then the slide match trials. You need to have a document to show all of these different tests and trials, which I'm going to show you how to create in a simple Word document, but all of these different things that you tried along the way. Now, usually when you get to like about the third or fourth one, the pathologist sees what he really likes and is acceptable, but you just want to be able to validate all the different ways that you got up to this point that was acceptable. The next is QA monitor. And QA monitor, I start with control block. Basically, QA monitor, this section, this foundation is basically about showing from a day-to-day basis that this stain is not only working day-to-day, but it's reproducible and it's consistent. And so QA monitor will not only show you the type of control block that you would want to use, and I personally recommend that you make your own. So I have some discussion in this presentation about tissue acquisition, how you get the tissue for your control block, daily monitor, how do you check the solutions each day or the stain each day, and how do you maintain those solutions throughout the course of your staining run, say 750 slides later, 1,000 slides later. How do you maintain that quality performance as in the first slide that's gone through? The next foundation is technical review. Now, everything basically that we're talking about now, there has to be some technical review or sign-off on it, and that's usually the medical director or a designee, such that when we get this control block that we're using, the pathologist or director or designee has to sign off on that this is a valid control, that he's acceptable being used with these tissues each day. The stain that you're using, the dyes and so forth, the stainer performance, all of these things have to be signed off on. And then finally, documentation. This is the last foundation, and this is the biggest one. And documentation, all of these different elements that we're talking about, these foundations, have to be documented, all the things that we've done on that. The stain and reagent, and I'm going to show you each one of these, how to create those documents. The template, and that would be in the stainer section. The trials and the validation runs that we've done, and mind you, the trials that we've done, and I mentioned in that document that so you can see the different changes that you did from run to run to get to the stain that the pathologist likes. Well, once you get to that stain, he's accepted that this is what I like. You have to do validation runs to make sure that it's reproducible and consistent from one run to another. So basically, after you've gotten that one staining method, you need to do, I'd say, 3 separate validation runs to verify that each one of those stains, procedures, or tests that you did are reproducible. Then you need review and sign-off in a documentation. Someone needs to review these things and sign off on it. This is the technical review. And then retention of data. All of these documents that we're talking about need to be kept together in some kind of data file. I like a hard copy myself, but also this electronic files. And I like to have both. And also retaining the slides that you finished with. You don't need to retain all the slides that you've done as you're doing all these tests, but the final slides that you came up with. So these are the foundations of an H&E validation. So let's first start talking about the stain. Now, I have 2 bullets here, one sheet and document, and then the technical review. Let's start with the one sheet documenting. You need basically one sheet documenting these 4 things on it: the method of staining that you're using, whether it's a regressive stain, a progressive stain, or hybrid. And once again, we're going to discuss hybrid in a few minutes. The hematoxylin used, the eosin used, and the reagents and stain used in the methods of and the methods of preparation if it's not commercial. If you're not buying these from a commercial vendor, the hematoxylin, eosin, even your alcohols, if you're making up your 95%, if you're making up your 80%, you need to have a statement in there saying that how you made that up. We took 100% alcohol and we diluted it this much water to this much alcohol to make 95%. So you need to say that because that's validating your stain procedure. I mentioned before regressive and progressive. As I said earlier, oftentimes those that are inspecting your lab might not have that information or background knowledge. So I like to put this into a statement, and on the next slide we're going to show how you weave all of this into one statement. So it's not like a lot. I mean, it looks very cumbersome right now and very voluminous, but it's not, and you'll see. The next bullet says technical review and sign-off of stain performance by the medical director or designee. So someone has to sign off that this stain is acceptable to me in the laboratory for our day-to-day H&Es. Now, I want to give you a word of caution. I say here, limit the number of reviewers because, this can get way out of control if you have, I don't know how many different pathologists looking at this and saying that this is the stain that they want or don't want. I remember I was in a huge laboratory and very impressive facility in Teterboro, New Jersey once, and I think they had 19 pathologists. And imagine trying to please 19 pathologists. Imagine trying to please 3. But, I mean, all of them have a preference. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the pathologist, but one likes it really, really dark in the nuclear staining. Another one likes it really, really red in the eosinophilic staining. But you have to get a blend of that, and that can be like a very challenging when you're validating this. Sometimes you can't get around it because I remember I was at one facility that had like 5 different satellite locations, 5 different hospitals, and the medical director at the main hospital wanted each facility, each medical director of that individual facility to look at this and sign off. So I really didn't have a choice right there. But once again, you want to try to limit the number of reviewers as best you can. This will take you 10 times as long if you have too many reviewers because it's hard to get everyone to come to a consensus. So now let's look at what I said before about progressive and regressive. Now you can tie all of this statement, I'm going to go back one slide, the one sheet documenting method of staining, hematoxylin, eosin, you can tie all of that into one statement that says this H&E stain was validated using a regressive method of staining using hematoxylin XXY where stain is applied, tissue is overstained with hematoxylin, differentiators used aggressively, blah, blah, blah. You can put all of this into one sentence. And I like to do that in my validations in case someone who is reviewing doesn't really know what regressive is. But I'm validating that this is the method that we use with this H&E, which this hematoxylin, to perform the stain, which is going to be at the end of this acceptable by the pathologist. So next is progressive, which is conversely, hematoxylin is applied, tissue is stained with hematoxylin only to a point. Traditionally, no differentiator is used. So you can weave this all into one statement, too. We use XXY hematoxylin under a progressive staining method where tissue is stained only to a point. There's no differentiator used and blah, blah, blah. So that can, like I said, be one sentence. And that's very helpful when you have your validation manual and someone's going through that to show or to let them understand the method that you use. And so I just put this in. Now, you don't have to put this text that I put in there, the progressive and regressive. You don't have to put that in there. All you have to do is put the statement under, and I'm going to go back. I hope I'm not confusing you. In that one sheet documenting these. Like I said, you can put all of this into one sentence. So I'm going to move ahead again. Oops. And so I have this, like I said, but you don't need to put this in there. I used this as a teaching slide once when I was actually teaching this to a group of new histotechs. So moving on to the next slide. We talked before about hybrids. So what makes one hematoxylin different from another? And I worked with this really brilliant gentleman once, Russell Myers, and he was a great histochemist. And I had an opportunity to work with him for a period of time. But he really taught me a lot about the difference between the progressive and regressive hematoxylins that are used. So on the far left, you see gills, and this would represent basically gills 1, 2, and 3. But you see there's the chemistry in that is basically, okay, the hematoxylin powder for one, but then there's aluminum sulfate, and then there's basically 3/4 water, and then 25% ethylene glycol. And over on the far right, you see more aggressive hematoxylin, Harris's, which is basically used in the progressive staining. And they have aluminum sulfate, but they also have this compound of ammonium in here. So you have aluminum ammonium sulfate. And I am going to switch phones very briefly. And hopefully the audience can still hear me. But in this Harris's, you see the aluminum ammonium sulfate. You see a higher percentage of water, and you see 5% ethyl alcohol. Now, the key thing about this addition of ammonia, this solution will almost immediately start oxidizing. And so with this oxidation, a precipitate forms, and it continues. You can reduce it, you can slow it down, but it's going to continue to oxidize. And so therefore, with these aggressive hematoxins, we have to filter it daily. And when you pour this out of your container, you notice these crystals at the bottom. Well, that's the ammonium salts precipitating out of the solution. So this solution is constantly changing. Conversely, over on the far left, the gills, they don't have that problem with precipitate. So you can get away with not filtering it every day, even though I think it's a good idea, but you don't have to. Now, the hybrids in between are like a blend of both, the left and the right. And each company has these, and they're like proprietary mixtures of how much they mix, but they're basically a little bit of both, and they do have a certain ammonium content in it, although there basically is not a problem with precipitation. And it does give you a darker, richer stain, basically, than the ones on the far left. And I think Harris is still considered the strongest hematoxylin, but it's very, very similar, if not in some of people's eyes equivalent. And so below that, you see some of the products that are on the market that fit into this hybrid category. The VWR, Premium 560 from one company, 560 MS. Richard Allen 7211 is actually considered in the far right, but it can be used as a hybrid. And so you can use it without a strong differentiator like in the Harris's. In the Harris's, you would use a strong differentiator as a regressive method to pull the hematoxylin back out. Those hematoxins stain everything, and you must regress or pull the hematoxylin back out of everything except the nuclei. Well, in these hybrid methods, they don't really use a strong differentiator. They use a milder acid wash, like a citrate a solution, and it's kind of like it's a pseudo progressive. They call it a progressive stain, but in essence, you are taking out some of the residual alcohol, even in these hybrid methods, because what it does is it clears up the excess mucin in the tissues or even off the slide. So it is, in a sense, regressing some of the hematoxylin, but this is considered to be a progressive stain where you don't have to use a really strong acid alcohol differentiator, but you use something small, a lot weaker, and they just call it a differentiator or something like that. So anyway, next slide. The stainer. Let's move on to the stainer. What you need in your documentation of that is a sheet that shows the final protocol, which shows the settings for the stainer. The rinses, the flow rate and intensity of the rinse can and will affect the intensity of the stain. Some stainers have a very mild, light trickle going through, and if you have it loaded with slides, that can affect the hematoxylin washing through and so forth, and even the differentiator rinsing out. You want to get all of that alkalinity rinsed out before it moves on to your bluing. So some stainers have a much more aggressive flush going through. So you want to document that. And then, as I said before, how the stainer is set up for agitations. Usually there's a set 1, 2, 3, 4 or something like that, the number of dips. and whatever program settings that are related to that stainer. So you want to document all of this in this one document. Then, you, as I said before, you want to have a picture of the template, a shot of the template that you're using, so that you can basically see where each reagent is going. And then the slide trials that you're using in that document that I showed you, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So, actually, here it is. This is basically, if you look on the far left, these are all the reagents and the steps that we're using in the stain procedure. It goes through deparaffinization at the top, xylene, 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 and then the alcohols, and then the 95s, and on to the rinse, and then the hematoxylin. So now you look at just to the right of that, our standard protocol. And so this is the protocol that we're using in the laboratory. And I used to work on a project called Slide Match that I was doing for a company. And so the standard protocol is what would be used, and then if I'm trying to match that or to improve it, these are the different stain trials that I would use. So if you're trying to validate your method, then you use the one that you're using now when you get a new stainer, or if you're just changing stains. And then stain trial 1 is in the next column, the third column from the left. And this is all the different things that you see here. And then stain trial 2, stain trial 3. Usually by the third or fourth stain trial, you've kind of narrowed this down where the doctor says, okay, this is acceptable. Now note in blue, there's like 4 different areas that are considered critical elements. You don't need to change all of these different things all over, but these 4 different things, the timing in the hematoxylin, the differentiation, the timing in that, the eosin, the timing in the eosin, and then coming right out of the eosin, the 95% alcohol, because the longer, the eosin in the presence of water will start to bleed back out of the tissues. So even that residual 5% in the 95% alcohol after the eosin, if you leave it in there long enough, it's going to really start bleeding alcohol back out, eosin back out. So you want to have a set timing on that. But these are the different variables that you want to go back and forth with, just these 4. You don't really need to worry about the deparaffinization or even the after the staining. You're going to go back to xylene. You might want to, and actually the bluing, you don't really need to change that either. But these are the 4 variables that you want to switch from and manipulate. So the standard protocol was 4 minutes in hematoxylin. But when I did ST1, I might have tried the same one. If I'm trying a different stainer, that might be not dark enough. So when I went to stain trial 2, I might have increased it by a minute, or the eosin or whatever. So this gives you a snapshot of all the different changes when you go back, so you can see how you got to this point. For example, if you got to stain trial 3, and then something happened and you had to move away from this for a while, or someone else took over this validation process, they need to be able to see how you got up to stain trial 3 so they don't start trying what you did back in stain trial 1 or 2. So you need this history right there. So now let's look at this. This is one stainer that I was using, and this is a template that we talked about. Now we're talking about the template. This is basically just a snapshot of how the stain is set up on the stainer. And in this type of stainer, you had it from the bottom. It starts in xylene at the bottom lower right, and it starts your deparaffinization. It goes from xylene, 100%, then 95%, then 80%, and then it jumps over to one of these water rinses that it has. And then it goes over to the hematoxylin, which should be in purple, then it goes to another water rinse, then it goes to the differentiation, so forth and so on. So, but note the small size of these receptacles. That's the first thing I want you to really pick up on. They're very thin, and it's fine. This stainer works great, but this is how one stainer is set up. And so when we move on, this is basically the protocol that was developed from that. And this is what you would have documented in your stainer also, the protocol that you used on that. Now let's look at this next, the stain template 2. This is a different stainer. I was at a lab once. We went from one stainer to another, and we tried to use the same protocol that we used in stainer 1, and it just didn't give us the same performance results. Now notice these receptacles are much bigger than the other one that I showed you before. And also on this instrument, the rinse was a lot more aggressive and a much more aggressive flush. And so with the other stain, there was kind of like a trickle, and yeah, it did rinse, but you might have to go a little bit longer on that stainer. Here, This was very good for rinsing away the excess hematoxylin, and also when you got to the clarifier, rinsing that off before you go into the bluing. So these different steps, they can really make a difference in the performance of your stain. So that's why I said it's important to put down, as you validate the stainer that was used, put down the information on the template. So now this is the final protocol. Once again, I'm showing you that we came up with the new stainer. Notice in the hematoxylin, we started off with 6 minutes and eventually rotated around. I think we wound up with 7 minutes with this. But once again, we're just checking these few variables. I added in one variable here, which was another 95% alcohol before the eosin. And so the reason why I didn't mention this before is that years ago, when they first, I'm talking about 1940s, the 50s, and 60s, they used to use just eosin, with very, very mild or small alcohol content. But progressively, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the alcohol content of these eosins was a lot stronger. So earlier, like I said, in the 50s and 60s, you needed 95% alcohol. If you look under the standard protocol, you needed a 95% alcohol to go into before your eosin, and that's the standard practice. But with these newer eosins that they came out with in the 80s and 90s, there was a higher alcohol content. So you could actually get away with going from that wash just before the 95 directly into the eosin, and it would still give you very strong eosinophilic staining qualities from the eosin. But when we went to a different stainer, and we were using that method without the 95%, but when we went to a different stainer, it was just rinsing out too much. And so we had to go back to adding that 95% in there. But I'm just telling you how one protocol from one stainer can be different from another. That's why it must be validated. And once again, you see these steps in the blue. These are the main critical points that you want to manipulate back and forth from your stain trial 1 to your stain trial 2 to stain trial 3. As I said before, usually after 3 or 4 trials, you should be where the doctor wants his stain to be. So now, once you have done these, this is what you're going to be looking at. This is a slide match program that I used to do. So here you see some derm tissue, and you see it on the 4X and 10X. And so on the 4X at the top, you see one stain trial that was done, of course, the much more nuclear staining in that. And below that, in the 4X, you see it's a much milder stain. Even the eosin is not picking up in the submucosal tissue. But so you don't see as much pink down there. But at the top, you do see a lot more staining, especially in the epithelial tissues and so forth. To the 10X, you can see it closer, that the melanocytes are staining much darker. The nuclei is really rich. The eosin staining is a lot stronger. But you look down below that in the lower right, and you see that that staining quality isn't there. Now, depending on the doctor, he might like the lower numbers, like the lower left and the lower right, or you might like the upper right. But this is what you're going to see with your stain trials. This is the transition that you're going to see, and the doctor will basically determine what he likes. Now we see those same slides in the next slide at the 20X and 40X. Of course, in the 20X, closer shot, you see the nuclear staining a lot richer. Even the eosinophilic staining is darker. And in the 40X, you see it very closely in the nuclear material of the cells. Next slide. So now moving on to the QA monitor, the next foundation. So I have in these 3 different elements of the QA monitor. The control block, if you're not testing, if you don't have a slide that you're running with your daily run, like at the beginning, then how can you really validate that this stain is going to be the same? And people have argued with me, we're using the same thing and we haven't changed anything. But to an inspector coming through, how can you validate that this, what you're running today, is going to give you the same performance that you know? So you take a control block that is going to give you a certain staining performance and quality from day to day because you've tested that control block. And hopefully what I recommend is that you make that control block. So you make a multi-tissue control block for that. And so the first bullet under there is tissue acquisition. Well, how do you get your tissues? And the primary source of getting your tissue is basically the growth room. And the secondary source, which I don't recommend but you could use, is you cannibalize blocks that you've had before in the past, which means you take other control blocks or other even tissue blocks, and you cut out certain sections that you want, and then you put that into a block, and that's your multi-tissue tumor block. Now, I worked at a lab, more than one, that they had one slide going through for their control block, and they had one tissue on that slide. And in one lab, it was like a section of tonsil or a lymph node. And so they ran that through every morning to validate the quality of the stain that they were doing. Well, that's great if you're just looking at nuclear staining, but that didn't tell me much about the eosinophilic staining, the acidophilic staining. It's just too much nuclear staining to really be able to determine that. So you needed to have in that control block also something that will show you the intensity of the nuclear staining. The eosin staining, whether you're going to get 3 shades of eosin or not. You can't really tell that in one tissue that's so densely packed with a nuclear affinity for the hematoxylin that it masks out everything else. So the next bullet, test each block separately before assembly. So all of these tissues that you're going to get together, you need to test them separately. You need to individually embed and section and stain those and look at them. And I have had people argue with me before, well, that just takes too much time, you're just increasing work. But it's you don't know these tissues, especially if you're getting them fresh from the growth room. I had a situation once where I had 5 different tissues that I made this was back when I first started doing this. When we finished, and I just went on and tested them all together and embedded them all together and then tested it. Well, 3 of the tissues were great, but 2 of them had some artifact and hemosiderin. Apparently, these were from autopsies that the body had been sitting for a while. So I just wasted all that time. So I had to go back and melt down that block, take the 3 good tissues out and so forth, and then replace the other 2. So the best way is just to start out by testing each block separately before you assemble them. Once you've done that and they look fine, then you want to assemble all of them into one communal control block. Once you've done that and stain that, you want technical review and sign off on this being a good, valid control. So that's one thing. Next is the daily QA monitor and maintenance monitor, stain and maintenance monitor. How are we going to validate that this stain is the same stain, gives the same stain performance as yesterday, and that it's reproducible, and that the 500th or the 1000th slide, it's going to be the same quality as the first slide. That's your stain monitor. And then the last thing I'm going to mention on this, and I'm going to go into detail on all of these, but there's a random QA slide review. And many labs can't do this because they just don't have the time or the personnel, but ideally you would want in every stain tray that's going out, you would want a certain percentage, 10%, 5%, the supervisor will determine that, but you would want to pull out randomly just so many slides from that stain tray and just do a quick screen of the slides before you send them out. That way you can keep an eye on the staining quality, whether the stain is dropping off, is bleeding out, or something like that. And also you can also have an idea, too, of some of the microtomy that's being done. And so it helps you with jumping on problems before it goes to the pathologist, because we can't really see everything until we look at it under the microscope. So you don't get to look at every slide, but you get to look at a random selection of them. And if someone is having a really bad problem with knife marks or they're not changing their blade enough, you can see that and go get a recut before you take this out to the pathologist. But it also, like I said, gives you a chance to look at your stain. Many labs don't have time because you basically have to dedicate one person to do this. In many busy labs, slides are flowing through all morning long. So that person is going to have to be pulled off the bench to do this. And oftentimes the supervisor doesn't have the time to devote an hour or 2 just to sitting at a microscope. But let's move into detail. The QA monitor, the control block. Let's talk about tissue acquisition specifically. Choose the tissue types. You determine that, and then inform the PA or pathologist to retain the tissues. And you need to leave a note because they're busy and they'll forget. You want to, once you get in those tissues, you want to gross and process the tissues types separately. And I put histotechnologist controlled on this because many times the PA or pathologist, they'll give you big hunks of tissue. And so you need to trim that down And only the histologist really knows what they really need, especially if you're going to try to put 4 and 5 tissues in one block. You know the size that you need and so forth. So the histotechnologist has to have control over this once you get that tissue. So either the supervisor or their designee needs to go back there and actually trim that tissue down, and then you want to process it and so forth. Once you've done that, you embed them, you section, stain, and review the individual tissue blocks, as I said before. And once they're acceptable, you embed all of them into one individual tissue, all the individual tissues into one communal block. This is where you have your multi-tissue block. You section that block, you stain it concurrently with the old control, and you have that technical review by the medical director or designee. Once again, limit the reviewers. And then at the final technical review of the validation runs by the medical director or designee, and then their sign-off. So just a note to the pathologists, because as I said, they will forget. So I post this in the gross room, in a couple of different places, specifically like right over the grossing table. But it's just a note to the pathologist to please, and I'll show you what the note looks like in a few minutes. But these are the different variety of tissues that I wanted, and even breast and colon, because someone asked me, well, don't you need a different processor for that? Well, I'm not validating the processing. I'm validating the staining. And usually when you put these on the stainer in the morning, all of these are going to go on the same staining run for the most part. Now, if you have a different staining procedure for your breast and colon, yes, you need to separate those out. But the main point I'm saying by putting these in red is you need to have some kind of representation of fatty tissue in there, in your control, in your multi-tissue control block. So you don't need all of these 7 tissues in here, but you do need 4 or 5. So skin, kidney, liver, lymph node, or tonsil, that'll give you the hematopoietic staining or the nuclear staining. Muscle shows you a lot about the eosinophilic staining, skin, but then breast and colon. So how that looks in a note is basically, I didn't put all of this in there, but I just basically put most of this text in there. This tissue request is for the purposes of standardization of and validation of runs on the new tissue processor unit. We used this method when we were testing out new tissue processors. The individual tissues will serve to validate the tissue processing units on the routine histological processing controls. And here I give them specific information, tissue requested, 3 cassettes of each. So they have all this information here. And then below, please place 3 cassettes of each type into 10% nutrient formalin and return to the histopathology department to the attention of, and then the supervisor's name and so forth. And you post this in the lab. And so this gives them specific instructions. Now, you might want to go do the 3 cassettes because, like I said, you want to trim them down. Because even if they do 3 cassettes, you're going to have to go back and look at that to make sure that these tissues aren't huge hunks that you're going to use, and sometimes that happens. So the next slide shows what it looks like when you're finished, the multi-tissue control block. And so this is one block sectioned and put onto the slide. And so in the lower right, you have, I think that's a small intestine. Then above that, in the upper right, you have, I think that's liver. And across from that, on the left, it's kidney. And in the middle, you have skin on the lower middle. And then to the lower left, I think that's tonsil that I had there, or lymph node. So this is what it looks like when you're finished. And so what we would do is we'd make like 5 or 6 of these blocks, and we test them, and we'd get verification and sign off on it, and the doctor approved them. We would run the block. And so then we would have all of these to run each day to verify our stain performance. Now next is the QA monitor. And so this is just a simple Word document that I created, a table on the far right. But if you see here, I couldn't get all of this on the PowerPoint. So this date on the left, this would go at the top of this table. And if you see in the left on the lower, you see change, rotation schedule. It says rotate, alcohols and xylenes, every 300 slides. Change the clarifier, which is the differentiator, and the bluing every 500 slides or sooner. And then change the hematoxylin eosin every 500 slides or sooner. Now, you determine the frequency of these changes. So, I mean, this is just what worked in this one lab that I was working in. And then at the bottom, you have the reviewer's signature and date, and that's where the supervisor signs this, or the designee each day. So you want one of these sheets for each day. And if you're running a lot of slides, you're going to need 2 or 3 of these sheets to represent one day. But this change and rotation sheet, this goes up under. Once again, this would be a Word document. It would go up under this table. And so you can get the date at the top of this table and then this change rotation at the bottom of the table, and that's your document. And you use this document every day when you start your H&E staining. And so the supervisor or whoever, usually the supervisor, at the end of the day takes these, and if it's multiple pages, you clip them, you sign off on the bottom of them, and you keep this in a file. And so the file is going to get huge because you're doing this every day, and you determine after 6 months or even a year that you start throwing out some of the files. That's up to the supervisor to decide. But you need this daily QA monitor sheet. So we already talked about the random QA on the slides going out each day. So I'm going to move on to the next foundation, which is a technical review and sign-off. You need a control tissue sign-off. Once you've made that control tissue block, the doctor needs to sign off on that. Then the protocol and slide trials via the control block, the new control block, that table that I showed you that had ST1, ST2, ST3, the supervisor can sign off on that, or whoever the supervisor has assigned to do these, not validation runs, but these protocol slide trials. It might be one person doing that, and it doesn't have to be the supervisor, but they would sign off on the bottom of that. And if I was a supervisor, I would co-sign on that too. And then, of course, all the validation runs. There has to be 3 validation runs after you come up with the protocol that the doctor likes, and that has to be signed off on too. So what does that sign-off look like? I'm going to show you some of the documentation here. So on the documentation, these are all the things that we talked about before, and all of this data has to be kept. So under the documents that you need the stains and reagents page that we talked about before that shows the method of staining, the stains you use. We need a sheet showing the template. We need a sheet showing the stain trials page that we use to show all the different trials that we tried, and that can be signed off, as I said before, by the supervisor or whoever the person that ran the trials. You need a sign-off sheet for the validation runs, those 3 validation runs, and then you need a review and sign-off page for the entire validation process or project. Now, below that, we're talking about data retention. This is still under documentation, data retention, keeping all of this data that we talked about, and then also the stain control and protocol validation slides. So all of the slides, not all, but the slides that we used when we validated the control and the slides that we used when we validated the slides, from the validation runs, not from all the different trials, just the validation runs. So all of this data has to be kept and maintained. Now let's look at, okay, this is a final sheet or document that you create once you've finished. And this says, this document outlines the Hematoxylin and eosin performance validation runs for the new automated stainer cover slipper for the Department of Histopathology. We're validating the stain on that. So phase 1, I'm very, I kind of get crazy about validation sometimes. So I'm going to explain that through phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1, 3 separate independent runs. These are validation runs. The routine H&E Hematoxylin eosin were performed on blank, blank, blank stainer using laboratory-validated existing multi-tissue control slides. Slides contain specimens of liver, kidney, whatever that you put in there. A control slide of the same type was also stained on the existing H&E stainer to show a comparison between existing and new stain performance. Now, phase 2. Now, this is just me. You don't have to do this. But, of course, this control that I just created is going to work because I control the tissue. I got the most perfect tissue I could find and so forth. But I wanted to validate how does this look on patient specimens. So I went back and took blind clinical trials. It says blind clinical samples were used for this live validation run. So I did validation runs on, I took tissues from, or slides, not tissues from, I took blocks from archive cases. And I did, it says 4 different blocks were selected from the blind clinical samples. Tissues on the slides, respectively, were tonsil, endometrium, and uterus. 2 blocks of tonsil were also submitted. So I wanted to show that, yeah, this works perfectly on the control that I selected. It should, because I controlled all of that. But it also has acceptable performance on patient specimens. Now, like I said before, you don't have to do that. I did that. The same basic H&E protocol, existing stainer and the blank stainer using the same dyes and reagents. Now, then I put a results, and you can just put basically 1-2 sentences there. See results sheets from the separate validation runs, which is what I put down. You don't have to write a whole thing back there. You can just actually leave that sentence there to show the results from each one of the validation runs. Then a summary, and you basically say a general statement saying that we validated this for, and you use those foundations for the stain, the stainer, the solutions that were used, and everything else. And we created a new multi-tissue tumor control block. You don't make a long statement here, but just 2 or 3 sentences, just to show the summary of what you did and the conclusions. And so then at the end of this, you put validation concluded. It means we're done. We've validated this, and you have a statement said instrument and validated protocol will be integrated into routine daily use for the hematoxylin eosin staining runs as of, and you put the date. That's your go-live date on the validated protocol. And the supervisor will sign that and date it, and the medical director will sign that and date it. Okay? So I know this is a lot of data to try to absorb. So now here are the validation results page. So once I've got my protocol and I have to do the 3 validation runs, okay, I used the old control when I was testing out the new control. So this is the stainer control 1, stainer control 2, stainer control 3, different trials on the new control. And I just gave this to the doctor because I didn't want to give them the option of going 0 to 10. Then I have to deal with what they pick 7 or if they pick 5 and what's the cutoff for acceptable. So I just gave them acceptable and unacceptable. And they were happy to check, these. And then the blind clinical validation trials, I used a new control on that. And I used blind trial 1, blind trial 2, blind trial 3. These are 3 runs that I did, and they just checked off on acceptable on that or not. And then, of course, the medical director signs that and dates it, and then the supervisor signs it and dates that too. So this is your validation results page that you want to have in that. Very important to have this because this sums everything up into the results. Finally, documentation, and we're coming to the end of the presentation. All that we've talked about, all those different 5 foundations, what you want to develop is this beautiful H&E systems validation manual. And so this is what you have, and here the contents are: the stain and staining method, the instrumentation, the QA monitor, daily stain monitor and maintenance, technical review, documentation, and also you want to put a copy of your H&E SOP in there. So all of this data is what you're going to present to the reviewer or inspector when they come in. They say, "Show me all your manuals." Well, most of the time they're not used to seeing something like this. But I've never met an inspector or had a situation like that where they weren't impressed with this, because very few labs go to this extent to validate their staining protocol, their routine staining protocol. But it should be, because we use this every day for patient diagnosis. So we should be able to validate that. And it's not that much work. And believe me, as a supervisor or manager, you're going to be so proud of this once you've developed it. And inside that, once I mentioned before, you keep all of the slides that you develop during this protocol, during this procedure. So here on the far left, you see these are the individual tissues that I put together. And then at the bottom left, you see them put into like the multi-tissue tumor block. But remember I said test them separately? And then this is how they put together. And so all of these were acceptable. And then next you see the same thing, the individual. And then so here on the far right, you see, I think these were the live trials that I did. I think this is on a patient specimen that had tonsil or something like that. But so anyway, the point is all the validation runs and all the other slides that you're using, not all the different slides that you did during the protocol development, but the validation runs and the control development, you want to keep those inside this manual. So what you come up with at the end is this beautiful manual right here. You present that, and this is your Hematoxylin eosin staining systems validation manual. And so whenever you change something in your system, you want to go, if you change hematoxylins, you want to go back and make an edit to that and revalidate. If you change locations, you might put a page in there saying that as of this date, the stainer was moved from one location to another. Stain was revalidated under the same staining system as we did here and proved acceptable, signed off acceptable by pathologists. Now, I'm rushing now because I'm coming to the end of time, and I want to give this back over to our facilitator, Eric. But I want to thank you all for attending. I know this is kind of rushed. This is normally like an hour and a half presentation or a three-hour workshop because we actually spend a lot of time on developing that control block. But I want to thank you all. I hope you've gotten something out of this that you can take back to your labs and start working on validating your own system. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric. And thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you very much, Skip. I will share my screen. There it is. Unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour nearly, so I will just take 1 minute to go through a reminder, and then, of course, you are free to quit the call respecting your time schedule. But if you have just a couple of minutes more, we will continue with a couple of questions that Skip will be answering. So